In 1978, the U.S.-Russian détente that had marked the mid-70s was beginning to collapse. President Jimmy Carter was a strong supporter of human rights, and relations with the USSR were strained. In the midst of this political frigidity, an extraordinary event occurred. An aircraft malfunction provided the catalyst for cooperation and compassion between the two superpowers. This is the story of a chain of events, of a miraculous ditch at sea, of men fighting to stay alive, and of the efforts to rescue them. This is the story of Alpha Foxtrot 586. October 26th was a typical fall day in Adak, Alaska. Swirling winds, rain, and snow showers. 15 crew members of Patrol Squadron 9 were scheduled to fly a 9-hour mission that would take them to the periphery of the Soviet Union. Alpha Foxtrot 586 took off at 8:45 without incident. Senior pilot Lieutenant Commander Jerry Grigsby made a routine decision to save fuel by shutting down an engine. The flight was uneventful for several hours, but shortly before 1 p.m., weather conditions began to deteriorate, requiring restart of the loaded engine. At that point, everything would change. The number 1 engine went off speed.
We were going out on a flight that was going to fly off the coast of Russia very close to look for any ships in the area, any radar that might be tracking us. We try to pinpoint where it came from and maybe get the frequency, and nothing else. It was just a routine mission in many ways. The only thing that wasn't routine about it is how close we had to fly to Russia. We started the engine back up because when we're in weather that's icy or cloudy, the engine doesn't have any way to de-ice itself or melt the ice off of it, and we were coming into weather like that, so we had to start the engine up. It's like it provides its own heat, just like a car radiator. And shortly after we started up, the speed of the engine started to increase, so much so that we had to shut it down. And by shutting it down, we really caused all the problems.
As the RPM climbed, the decision was made to feather the number 1 engine. Flight engineer Butch Miller pulled the E-handle. Fuel flow and horsepower dropped, but the RPM continued to climb. The prop had failed to feather.
It never really struck me yet what they were talking about. There was a trouble, but okay, one engine doesn't work, it's on fire. I was much more concerned about the engine propeller coming off and going through the airplane.
By now, Jerry Grigsby was in the left seat. He reduced speed and climbed in an attempt to slow the RPM. It is believed that in the noise and confusion created by the overspeed, the fails to feather checklist procedures were not completed.
And the most obvious problem was aural. You could hear the noise, and so you didn't really need gauges to tell you what was going wrong. And the cockpit in the P-3 was very wide, and Jerry sat probably farther than a normal couch seat away from him. The engineer sat back about here. So in order to communicate across that distance, you had to physically lean over to talk to him. So once the emergency happened, I couldn't really talk to Jerry at that time.
There would be subsequent fires, and an eventual catastrophic failure of the assembly.
It was only until one point when Matt Gibbons, pointed out that, we had used all the fire extinguishers. So at that point, we're flying along with an engine on fire and a wet wing with fuel there.
The emotions were surprisingly cool throughout that 90 minutes. People knew that this was very abnormal. I mean, people are not used to that kind of noise and vibration, which was overwhelming. As things progressed from one engine fire to the next, to the next, to the next, and we ultimately had 4 fires, we realized that our options were pretty limited.
The primary flight engineer, Ed Flo, changed spots with him, and when Miller came back into the tube, you could tell in his face and his eyes, the tone of his voice, that we were in severe trouble. We were too far to get anywhere quickly, except maybe by landing in Russia, which at the time, during the Cold War season, was just not an option.
True. I don't think anybody thought at first that we were going to have to ditch. I think they all thought we could limp back to Shemya, which was, I'm guessing, about 500 miles away, maybe 550. The problem was, normally we would fly at 200 miles an hour or so, but we couldn't fly that fast. If we flew that fast, the propeller would turn a lot faster, so when we couldn't control the plane. So to make the propeller turn slower, we had to turn slower. The air going over the wing was what was causing the speed of the propeller to turn too fast. So we were flying maybe 120, 130 miles an hour, which now meant instead of 2.5 hours, we might be 5 hours before we could get back. And I think about the 30-minute mark, maybe 40-minute mark, we realized that we probably weren't going to make it, and that's when the decision was made, when we do have a fire, we will have to.
The decision to ditch, to attempt putting an aircraft down in the frigid, stormy waters of the North Pacific, was undoubtedly the hardest decision ever made by Lieutenant Commander Jerry Carson Grigsby. But he was faced with the fear that the now wobbling prop might spin off into the fuselage, and another fire could easily destroy the wing. Either way, the aircraft would lose control and dive into the ocean, a sure death for all 15 men on board. 5 hours and 45 minutes after a routine takeoff, Jerry Grigsby made the decision to ditch his aircraft.
Mayday, Alpha Foxtrot 586. We are ditching. 15 on board. 3 orange life rafts. 3 orange life rafts. Over.
All of our knowledge up to this point, there hadn't been a successful ditching of a P-3 anywhere. And even though what we had been told, you know, the other large aircraft had successfully ditched and all, but we weren't sure of that.
We had secured everything in the aircraft as best that we could, so that there was no loose objects. I remember just a fear I've never felt before, and I hope to never feel again.
I had no concept of what was going to happen. We had drilled and practiced this many times, but you know, it was only because of Jerry's expert aviation skills to be able to land an airplane that was not designed to land on water, to be able to hit the wave in the right way. Jerry actually had been trained to fly seaplanes prior to coming to P-3s, so he knew about landing a plane that was designed to land on water, landing on water. I'm not so sure that another pilot who hadn't had that training would be able to be the right man at the right place to put that airplane down and to enable us to have the opportunity to survive.
In his book Adak, Andy Jampelier writes, PD-2 hit the water at around 60 to 70 knots or more, weighing approximately 52 tons. The resulting impact was enormous and battered the aircraft powerfully, immediately wrecking major structural damage and speeding its sinking. By all accounts, PD-2 went down very quickly.
I compared it probably to the worst landing plus I've ever been in.
The first hit was like a rock on a smooth lake. It's just a little skim of a hit. I think that's when our 3 engines exploded.
I remember the feeling of the shoulder harnesses cutting into me, so it was like I was being hoisted up face down into the shoulder harnesses. So I would say there was probably in excess of 1 or 2 G's pulling for me decelerating forward.
And I was alert and awake. The next second, I was completely dazed and out of it. And if they hadn't gotten me up or woken me up or snapped me back to, I would have just been sitting there.
Darkness was real quick. There was no lights. If the emergency lights were working, I didn't notice them. I had been practicing on how I was getting up, and as soon as we stopped, popped my seatbelt, started forward, and ran directly into the lap.
And from that moment on, my next recollection is that the water was already this high. I mean, the water was already up to the bottom of our chairs. And it was time to go, let's get out of here. And started yelling, let's go, let's go, let's go. And got people lined up at the overwing exits and started pushing people out as the water was rushing in. And the water got real deep real quick. It was very dark. It was a little bit smoky, but it was, I think everybody was shocked at how quickly the airplane sank.
2 rafts had been launched, a smaller 7-man raft and a large one designed for 12 men. Ironically, and ultimately tragically, 9 men would find their way to the smaller raft, and only 4 men ended up in the larger one. Commander Grigsby did not make it to a raft, nor did Petty Officer Butch Miller, who presumably never left the aircraft.
And I yelled for Butch, and I got no answer. And I had a distinct feeling that there was no one there but me. And I turned back around and looked forward, and then I turned back and yelled Butch again and got no answer. And then I proceeded forward to leave in the airplane. And through these years, that's one thing I truly have regret, because not only was I close to Butch as a crew member, as an officer, I felt I probably had an obligation to look for Butch more than just call for him. And I regret that, I do. When I exited that port side and inflated my LPA, the life preserver, I saw Jerry Grigsby on the top of the aircraft kneeling. His assigned exit point is right above the cockpit, and he was kneeling on the aircraft, looking toward the back of the aircraft, and made eye contact with me.
I remember seeing him up there, and I assumed he was counting heads, making sure everybody's off the airplane, doing his job as a plane commander.
We watched the skipper of the ship, Jerry Grigsby, could not possibly swim over. We watched him. I'll never forget it. He got out the flight station, walked or crawled back on the fuselage. What are my best chances? He waited and he said, I'll go for them. And as he jumped in and slid down the side, he was trying. It was no.
He was struggling to make it to the raft, and we all wanted to see that happen, and feeling a bit helpless to do that. And it was my thought that, well, let's try and maybe tow the raft to him. And so it was me and a couple other guys did get in the water and attempt to do that, which it was pretty obvious even initially there once we first started that there's just no way this could work. The raft is too heavy, and we're drifting way further than we could possibly swim it to it.
Even before the plane hit the frigid sea water, rescue efforts were underway. Lieutenant J.G. Mac Gibbons had been in contact with Elmendorf Air Force Base throughout the ditching ordeal. An Air Force RC-135, commanded by Captain Alan Feldkamp, was part of the Cobra Ball mission. They were the first to arrive on scene.
Intelligence collections on ICBMs off the coast of Kamchatka and the Kaluchi range. And the mission we were on was a 1 Alpha, category 1 Alpha mission, which is the highest priority mission you could have. So diverting us from that mission to go that day to make that collection on this ICBM vet to go down and pick up, the P3 guys was or to find them was a major event. And it had never, I don't know if it's ever happened since. I mean,
We actually had a position to start with, the one that was off of our charts, and he drew lines and made a chart up. And we headed down there, and when we got close to the position, we were at 30,000 feet or whatever we were flying at, which is way too high. So we started to descend through the clouds.
We shortly found the raft as well, and that was about the size of the head of the needle, but it was orange, and you could see it out there. But
in the waves and in the wind.
Yeah, I didn't think we had a prayer of even seeing them.
What really gave me the feeling for it was when we dropped through the clouds and saw the seas. I mean, they were huge. Those are the biggest waves I've ever seen in my life.
I would have never thought they would. Yeah. I would have just said,
The Navy Ready Alert Crew 11 from Adak, squadron mates of the downed airmen, would be the next on scene.
I remember sprinting for the aircraft to get the inertials going and fire up the radios. I can remember running as fast as I could to get to that ladder, to get the airplane going.
And our first plan of attack was to swap positions with the Air Force C-135, so because they're a jet and they don't do very well down low for long periods. So after a couple of tries, we got that swapped out, and then what helped immensely was that initial data by the Air Force gave us the initial general location, and then once we got down as low buoy, between a couple of flares and some excellent information from the Air Force guys on datum, we were able to see them visually.
You see some rafts, so there's some survivors, but then, I'm kind of thinking to myself that, wait a minute, this is not good. What do we do to save these guys now? So.
During the next 4 hours, Crew 11 would fly over the 2 rafts, struggling to keep them in sight. Cobra Ball would relay communications and break away only long enough to refuel.
When Cobra Ball, which was the RC-135, with the first aircraft on top of us, when we saw that come overhead, it was like, okay, somebody knows we're here.
We got very excited when the Air Force plane came by, because it's not every day that you see a 707 flying by at 500 feet. And that was like, okay. And then the P-3 showed up, and then the C-130. So we could see that the U.S. was responding with everything they could get there. And then we just figured it was a matter of time. But as the day wore on and the day became night, and we got colder and colder and colder, it was like, hey, the ship's not here yet, what's going on?
The initial euphoria of having lived through the ditch gave way to mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion.
The time dragged on, I think, as the adrenaline wore off. I mean, things came back to like a normal speed, and then it was just a matter of time. It was just us against the cold.
We had to bail water, and we used our helmets. We had nothing else to use, so we would give someone our helmet as they came out, and they would bail. And it was really a futile
to work, simply because every time we get it reasonably the amount of water in the raft down, another wave would break over us, and it was a waste of energy, and to do that is counterproductive to survival. So we didn't do that for a very long time, and then once you get settled in, that's when I think you start to think about other things and the length of time it might take for somebody to get out to you.
While the men in the raft silently fought against the numbing effects of hypothermia, the rescue efforts had expanded. Lieutenant J.G. Bill Porter's Coast Guard C-130 aircraft and crew were headed to Kodiak Island. They had left Adak shortly after Alpha Foxtrot 586 on that fateful October day, and were within an hour of home when they received a message that there was a downed aircraft, 1,300 miles west, more than 4 hours away. They would return to Adak and refuel before heading to the ditch site to relieve Crew 11. They were not optimistic.
We got on scene roughly 8:30, roughly. And that time might be wrong, that doesn't matter. We were there flying back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, to the ship, to the position, back and forth.
We had to relieve the other aircraft that was on scene. And they were at 500 feet, and we wanted to go down to 500 feet. 500 feet, 500 feet, you run into each other. So we came up with this system where we gave him 2.9 and we put 9.2 in our tack ends. And that way we had a distance between aircraft. And so when that was increasing, he climbed, we descended. And that's how we traded off positions first off.
From the time